most aggressive options to play against d4 is the King's Indian defense. And its reputation has started to slip ever since Kasparov dropped the opening a few decades ago. And it's becoming more and more difficult to play with a number of good theoretical options that White has to throw against it. Now, as I've gotten older, I definitely enjoy Fianchetto systems. And as we've seen in recent videos, you have the opportunity to play systems like the automatic English. And it definitely works in this position as well as an option to play that knight c3, d3, typically get the bishop out of the way, and you play for b4. So going on with that automatic English theme, if you wanted to play this way, you definitely can. I like the bit more ambitious d4, which allows for a number of different King's Indian variations, from the classical with knight bd7 to different lines stemming from c6, either queen a5 or bishop f5 are quite popular. But probably the king, theoretically, from this position is going to be the Panno style of play with this a6 and rook b8. This is going to be a bit of a stem variation off of the Panno, which has gotten very popular. And I had trouble playing against it for a long time. I remember reading, say, the Grandmaster Repertoire Series book. This was 2000s with a rook. And after e5, you just get this type of position with e4, maybe like knight e1, knight d3. And I felt so uncomfortable because I'm giving a King's Indian player what he wants. He wants to play for, f5 with a closed center and go for an all-out attack. So this to me just didn't make a lot of sense. And another line which has grown in popularity has been knight b8, and the idea is to go a5 and either knight a6 or knight d7, and you get the c5 square. So, being an intuitive player, I want to have lines that I can remember, and I want to try to prevent my opponent from getting natural play. So after knight e7, a move that works with both knight b8 and knight e7 is c5 here. You go, well, if he takes, okay, I just grab the e-pawn. And pretty sure we're doing completely okay here, as discovered moves like knight f takes d5, I'm fine with this type of trade down because we have the in-between knight takes f7, and White's got a better position. So what can they really do here? My opponent reacted poorly to this, went knight d7, I'm able to take, and from my understanding of playing these structures, like, okay, that's the weakness, that's the Benoni pawn, so I'm going to borrow an idea from a completely different opening and play against this weakness. So what do I mean? Well, typically, and we'll go with a move order to get to the Benoni, which probably could be a bit more accurate, but we'll get to the overall point after a6. We go a4 to stop b5 for multiple reasons. And we already have the bishop hitting the d-pawn. So the typical plan here is to go knight d2 to c4, where we pile up on d6. Plan in the Benoni. So when I come back to the main game, where c takes d6 has been played, I want to pile up on the d6 pawn. Well, I'm not going to have bishop f4, so I'm going to need another piece that can work on dark squares to pile up on it. And I had a knight on c4, which seemed very flexible, so I start with knight d2. Black continues with natural expansion on the king side. Now, if I go knight c4 immediately, b5 could be a problem at some point. So I go a4 first. And after e4, knight c4. My opponent goes knight e5. And I don't want to lose ground. Very often, you see in Benoni-esque positions, they'll go knight a3. But this position's slightly different because the trade doesn't bother me so much. If you end up going for a variation with knight takes, I'll use the other knight going to b5 and say after a6, knight c7. You got a lot of flexibility of ideas here. With the knight coming to e6 in some lines, my bishop, well, probably not even bishop d4. If something like rook b8 happens, bishop a7 looks pretty annoying. So there's definite ideas to consider in this position. I like white. Well, after queen b3, black plays a6. So if you've been following along in the videos lately, you've been hearing about the thinking process, which is considering the most forcing moves. And you should definitely consider the most forcing moves here. When I see a6, I see the potential of b6 being used by the knight at some point. So I didn't strongly consider the most forcing move in the position knight takes e5 because I like the tension, and I saw that if black changes his mind and plays knight takes c4, my queen really doesn't have a bad square. So here though, if you're playing the home game, knight takes e5 is considered most accurate by the machine, followed by bishop e3, where it goes for this plan to just lock down the b6 square, which we'll see in a lot of, say, Sicilian Najdorf positions, where white's been able to get the pawn to a5, and then they just sink minor pieces into the b6 square, which is quite annoying. So a6, I went bishop f4 because that square is free, and I'm going along with that theme from the aforementioned Benoni. Well, bishop d7 is played, and I see the potential for some tactics here. So knight takes e5 is likely stronger than what I played in the game, but bishop takes e5, a capture on e5 was screaming to be played. And after pawn takes, knight b6, getting ready for this nasty discovery, hitting the rook, so as the rook gets defended, check. And now it's a question of how can we win as efficiently as possible? It's very often when analyzing my students' games, when they get a big advantage like this, it's like, oh, okay, I can just trade pieces and win. I'm gonna just like turn off thinking. And then they end up not being optimal, getting into trouble, and occasionally drawing or losing games, which should be easy wins. So let's walk through and try to be brutal and efficient to win this game. Very often myself, when I get in these positions, I try to put more pressure to play perfectly. I want to match up as close as I can with the engine in these types of positions, and that's what kind of keeps me honest, so to speak. Well, we're up material, simplify the win. So here, I'm going to go ahead and grab the bishop to start. Well, I've got pieces that aren't working, and in order to really devastate the opponent, I'm going to need harmony with all of my pieces, and the only chance black really has is an all-out attack on the king side. So if I can keep attacking him, he doesn't have time to generate counterplay. So rook fd1, getting a rook on the open file where it belongs, getting a tempo on the queen. And after queen e7, same sort of theme again. Okay, knight d5, getting the knight closer to the action, more options, getting a tempo on the queen. So queen f7. Can't move the knight again, I'd hang my queen. Black could have the potential to play b5. I go queen b6. I get away from the pin. I get a pretty good foothold on c7, where I'm thinking maybe a rook lift could be helpful, hitting this b-pawn and lining up potential attacks later. So my opponent goes rook fd8. Okay, this is slowing down my attack, but need to defend the knight. So what's the most aggressive and forcing move to deal with this problem on the knight? Knight c7. It says, hey, would you like to trade rooks? Simplifying the win. You've got a good piece on the open file. I'd love for you to capture and improve my a1 rook that's not doing anything. So rook d7 works the same to me. Now again we ask, what is the most forcing and aggressive move? Well, we can tactically exploit the pin on the b7 pawn, so knight takes a6. He's not interested in capturing. So our knight's being threatened. What's the best way to deal with this threat? With tempo, knight c5, hitting the queen, hitting the b7 pawn. Now queen d4. There's some potential of e3 being played, which could mess with my structure. So just play e3, get a tempo on the queen. Now queen d2. Am I really worried about anything here? Not too much. The main thing is I don't need this bishop coordinating on f2. And I don't need his rook getting activated in any way to coordinate on f2. That's it. If I keep the opponent's pieces bad, the queen by herself is doing very little. So I go b4. I don't grab the b7 pawn because I'm trying to limit any potential counterplay. And there's no access to key squares for the opponent's pieces. So you can just slowly improve without risk here. Queen b2, one move threats, one move solutions. Where's the best square for the rook? On the open file. h5. Okay, maybe you could go h4 and get some play. So I'm going to shut that down, h4. And if you do something like f4 here, well, you're dropping the e-pawn and it's blowing up the position more, but at the same time, still have these types of ideas. There's so many just strong ideas for white, but I'm focused on stopping counterplay more than anything else, because if your opponent can't really attack, can't do anything, really no risk. So after h4, the opponent takes time to defend g6. All right, you're lining the king up there. Let's improve the rook, pinning the bishop. After queen c1 check, well, my g2 bishop hasn't been doing much the entire game, so I don't really have a problem improving it, going to f1, so at least it has some scope now. Queen e1 is played, and this is optimism that maybe we could get in f4 and have enough time, but you don't. Queen takes b7, grabbing a pawn, adding more pressure to the bishop, and after rook g8, add a bit more pressure and get the win. And the opponent resigned here, as there is no way out of this situation. So hopefully you enjoyed this quick video on these Panno ideas in the Fianchetto King's Indian. And this is a line that I very much like since I found it, and it's something that I play frequently. The engine gives it roughly zeros as soon as you play c5, but I believe you have in the very least a moral victory that you've taken away standard play from black. So I like it. Hopefully you like it too. And if you do like it, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. Helps out. Thanks.